You feel it the moment you wake up. The scratch at the back of your throat. The heaviness behind your eyes. The creeping certainty that something is wrong inside your own body. You reach for your phone, search your symptoms, and within minutes, you have a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and a pharmacy 2 blocks away. Now, subtract all of that. The phone, the pharmacy, the diagnosis, the germ theory of disease, the antibiotics, the antivirals, the concept of a vaccine. Subtract 200 years of medical science and ask yourself, what do you have left? You have your body, your fire, your community, and an immune system 300,000 years in the making. For the overwhelming majority of human history, infectious disease was not a problem you could solve. It was a force you had to survive. And the fact that you exist right now, that your ancestors made it through, means they were, in ways that would surprise you, extraordinarily good at it. So, what did they actually do? To answer that, you have to understand what ancient disease actually looked like. And here is where most people's mental image falls apart. The common assumption is that prehistoric life was a constant plague, bodies dropping everywhere, infection spreading through entire bands, death at every turn. But the archaeological and epidemiological evidence tells a more complicated story. Researchers like University of Cambridge biological anthropologist Piers Mitchell has spent decades analyzing ancient skeletal remains and, coprolites, fossilized human feces, to reconstruct the actual disease burden of pre-agricultural humans. What he found challenges everything you think you know. Hunter-gatherer bands were small, typically between 20 and 50 people. They moved constantly, and because they moved, they never stayed long enough in one place for their own waste to contaminate their water supply at scale. The parasites and gut pathogens that would later devastate settled farming communities, intestinal worms, typhoid, dysentery, were far less prevalent in mobile foraging populations. The very lifestyle that seems brutal by modern standards, no fixed home, no permanent settlement, was also a form of passive disease control. The big killers we associate with ancient history: smallpox, measles, bubonic plague, influenza. Most of these are what epidemiologists call crowd diseases, infections that require dense, sedentary populations to sustain themselves. They need enough bodies packed close together, in contact with enough animals and contaminated water and shared air, to keep transmitting. A band of 30 people moving through a vast landscape does not give a pathogen that environment. These diseases, known as catastrophic as they became, were largely a consequence of agriculture and urbanization, not a constant feature of deep prehistory. This does not mean ancient humans were untouched by disease. They were not. Tuberculosis left its signature on bones more than 500,000 years ago. Dental infections killed. Wounds got infected. Childbirth was dangerous. Respiratory illness swept through camps in cold months. The difference is the scale, the type, and, critically, the strategies your ancestors had developed over hundreds of thousands of years to deal with what they faced. The first and most underestimated strategy was behavioral, isolation and avoidance. There is strong cross-cultural evidence, compiled by evolutionary biologist Randy Thornhill and his colleagues, that humans have what researchers call a behavioral immune system, cluster of instincts and social responses that activate when the body detects signs of infection nearby. Aversion to certain smells, disgust at visible symptoms, automatic social distancing from someone who looks or acts unwell. These are not cultural inventions. They are ancient biological responses, hardwired because the individuals who had them were more likely to survive. In practice, this meant that someone who was seriously ill in a hunter-gatherer band would often be moved to the edge of the group, not abandoned, but separated, fed and visited, but kept from the shared sleeping space and the communal fire. This is documented across contemporary forager societies studied by anthropologists like Kim Hill and A. Magdalena Hurtado in their decade-long work with the Ake people of Paraguay, one of the most thoroughly studied hunter-gatherer populations in the world. Sick individuals were cared for, but the group also protected itself. The second strategy was pharmacological and far more sophisticated than most people realize. Your ancestors lived inside a pharmacy. They just did not call it that. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were in constant, intimate contact with their environment. They ate hundreds of plant species. They watched which plants sick animals sought out. They observed cause and effect across generations, accumulating what ethnobotanists call traditional ecological knowledge. a living library of information about which plants reduced fever, which reduced inflammation, which stopped bleeding, which killed parasites in the gut. The evidence that this knowledge is ancient and not simply coincidental keeps growing. In 1960, paleoanthropologist Ralph Selecki, excavating Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraq, discovered the burial of a Neanderthal individual dating to roughly 60,000 years ago. Clustered around the bones were high concentrations of pollen from at least 8 plant species: yarrow, groundsel, ragwort, ephedra, and others, many of which have documented medicinal properties. The interpretation remains debated, but the possibility that even Neanderthals were deliberately placing medicinal plants with their dead has never been dismissed. More recently, studies of wild chimpanzees have documented what researchers call zoopharmacognosy, the behavior of self-medicating with plants. Sick chimps have been observed swallowing whole, undigested leaves of Aspelia plants, which carry compounds active against parasites and bacteria. If our closest living relatives do this instinctively, it is not a stretch to believe your Homo sapiens ancestors had refined the same instinct into something far more intentional over 300,000 years. In the bioarchaeological record, we can trace this. Dental calculus, the hardened tartar on ancient teeth, has become one of the most remarkable windows into what ancient humans consumed. A 2017 study by Christina Warner and her team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology analyzed dental calculus from Neanderthal remains at El Sidón Cave in Spain. Among the compounds they detected were chemicals from yarrow and chamomile, bitter plants with little caloric value. The most likely explanation is medicinal use. The third strategy was the one your body was doing the whole time, with or without your ancestors' help: the immune system itself. This is where the story becomes personal. The human immune system is not a passive system. It is an adaptive, learning, remembering architecture. The innate immune system, your first line of defense, responds to pathogens immediately with inflammation, fever, and the mobilization of immune cells. Fever, which feels like a symptom, is actually a weapon. Raising core body temperature makes the environment hostile to many bacteria and viruses. Your ancestors could not have known this mechanically, but they knew that a sick person who burned through a fever and survived often recovered. They were not wrong to let it run. The adaptive immune system goes further. After exposure to a pathogen, after surviving it, your body builds memory. It learns the enemy. Subsequent exposures trigger faster, stronger responses. This is the biological principle underlying vaccines, but it was operating long before anyone understood it. Your ancestors lived in an environment full of pathogens their line had been encountering for millions of years. Many of those pathogens had shaped the genome you carry today. Variants in your immune gene, the genes that determine how your body recognizes and fights infection, bear the marks of ancient epidemics. Researchers studying ancient DNA, including work by Johannes Krauss and his team at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, have traced specific immune gene variants that became common during periods of intense pathogen pressure. You are, in your very cells, a record of every epidemic your line survived. The fourth strategy was social, and this one is the most human of all. Infectious disease does not just attack the body. It attacks the capacity to find food, to carry water, to maintain warmth, to protect the group. A sick person, in a world where survival was physical and daily, was immediately dependent. The question of how ancient humans treated their sick is therefore not a question about compassion alone. It is a question about survival logic. The answer, repeated across the archaeological record, is that they cared for them aggressively. In 1971, paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkaus published analysis of the Shanidar 1 Neanderthal, a male who had lived with extensive injuries that had healed over time: a withered arm, a crushed eye socket, severe arthritis. He had survived for years with impairments that would have made him a liability in any purely competitive survival calculus. He survived because others fed him, protected him, and kept him alive. His existence is proof not of charity, but of a community that understood interdependence deeply enough to maintain it even at cost. The same pattern shows up across dozens of ancient sites. The Romedo II individual from Italy, a young adult who had lived for years with a severe bone disease affecting limb function. Multiple individuals at Atapuerca in Spain who showed signs of prolonged survival after severe trauma. Care of the sick is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest human behaviors in the fossil record. Your ancestors survived disease through movement, through plants, through each other, and through a body shaped by millions of years of exposure to the very pathogens they fear. And here is the counterintuitive twist that ties all of this together. When agriculture arrived, roughly 12,000 years ago, it did not make disease easier to survive. It made it worse. Dramatically worse. Subtle populations living near their own waste, keeping domestic animals that became reservoirs for new pathogens, trading with distant communities across continents. This is what unleashed the great crowd diseases. Measles, smallpox, bubonic plague, cholera. The skeletal record shows a sharp decline in average human health in the millennia immediately following the agricultural transition. Ancient farmers were shorter, more nutritionally deficient, and more heavily parasitized than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. What saved the post-agricultural world was not a new human strategy. It was the very same one, the adaptive immune system, building memory generation by generation, century by century, until populations that had been devastated by a new disease gradually became resistant to it. The strategy was ancient, only the pathogen was new. You feel that scratch at the back of your throat, the heaviness behind your eyes, and somewhere in your body, 300,000 years of survival memory activates. Silent, automatic, and older than language itself. The same thing your ancestors felt, in a cold camp under an open sky, with nothing but fire and each other and the intelligence buried deep in their cells. They made it. And so, in ways you have never had to prove, will you? If this journey through our deep past changed how you view your own body, share this with someone who needs a reminder of what they are made of. Hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history of human survival, and let me know in the comments which of our ancestors' survival strategies surprised you the most.